So Newcastle Hospitals has declared a climate emergency. In this teaching, we'll take a look at why this declaration is so important for the Trust, our city, and our NHS as a whole. We'll start by talking about how the crisis represents the greatest threat that humanity has ever faced, but conclude with a message of hope and how this could also be our greatest opportunity and the key role that we, working within healthcare, could have in this. Probably the best vantage point to appreciate our planet's difficulties is when you are no longer on it. This picture of the Earth, taken from the International Space Station, shows the barely visible rim of the atmosphere, the thinnest of margins between life and death, and within which all of human history, and in fact all of biological history, is played out. A starker illustration of the finite nature of Earth's resources is hard to find, especially when you take a step even further back to view the fragility of the planet from the immensity of space. The pale blue dot, as taken from the Voyager space probe as a last goodbye. You may have noticed that this talk is 11 minutes long, and it's being first delivered at 11 AM on a Friday in September 2019. This is symbolic, as it represents the 11 years it's estimated that we have left to avoid truly catastrophic global heating, according to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. But what are the consequences if we do not get our house in order? Our heating planet will experience more and more extreme weather events. Cities will flood and crops will fail. Nature will continue to decline, and there will be increasing competition for increasingly scarce resources, with war, mass migration and starvation as direct consequences of this. We're even warned of the very real threat of the collapse of civilization. But it's very tempting to switch off from these threats that seem so remote from our everyday experiences, our family, our friends, our leisure time and our interests, and the work that we do at Newcastle Hospitals. In fact, we humans are hardwired to survive in a very different environment. The vast majority of human history has been spent when we only had to worry about what threats lay around the corner, or at most, a season or two ahead. But from time to time, we're now catching something just out of the corner of our eye that starts to trigger alarm bells. It may be something happening in another part of the world, or someone trying to make themselves heard closer to home. And here's some bad news. The IPCC based their 11-year timeline for definitive action on the assumption that emissions could not only be reduced, but that greenhouse gases could actually be drawn down from the atmosphere through different technologies that do not currently exist. Here's some worse news, and that is the risk of tipping points, the points at which natural feedback loops cause global heating to accelerate off at dizzying and irreversible rates. Although these tipping points are difficult to predict, it was thought that these would only occur some decades into the future. We are, however, seeing evidence of this now, with the record melting of the Arctic permafrost that was not predicted to occur until 2090. This melt has caused vast areas of Arctic land to collapse and risks the release of huge quantities of methane, which is many times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. We are also seeing dramatic melting of the Greenland ice cap, with, this summer, 12 billion tonnes of ice lost in just one single day. Here in the UK, the 10 hottest years on record have all occurred since 2002. Our heat waves are not just hotter, but are lasting longer, as weather systems park themselves over us for extended periods of time due to the weaker polar jet stream. In the heatwave of 2018, for instance, UK crop yields had started to fall. Had the heatwave gone on for just a little while longer from July onwards into August, these crops may have started to fail. So global heating has become very much a bread and butter issue for us in the UK too. So Parliament declared a climate emergency this year, with a commitment for the UK to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. It's important to recognise that, firstly, change needs to start now. One of the only graphs this talk is using unapologetically here shows that 50% of all fossil fuels burnt since 1750 have been consumed since 1990. Our reliance on fossil fuels is deeply embedded, so turning our ship around has to start sooner rather than later. The second point to remember is that 2050 may be too late to act because of the increasing risk that we're close to catastrophic tipping points. The final point to note is that when we look at UK emissions, we need to take account of those emitted on our behalf by other countries who manufacture our goods. When we take these into consideration, our performance doesn't look nearly as good. So what has this got to do with healthcare? We know that global heating will have a major impact on health. Already, we see a mental health crisis in other parts of the world as the climate changes. And here in the UK, eco-anxiety is becoming a recognised phenomenon, especially amongst those younger people who are going to have to face the worst ravages of climate breakdown. Heat waves will become longer and more severe, and there will be parts of the world which will become uninhabitable. In the worst of the predicted heat waves, temperatures may be so high that they will kill even healthy people in the shade within hours. Here and now in Northern Europe, our most vulnerable, the young, the very old, and those with medical conditions, are already experiencing heat-related problems. The European heatwave of 2003 led to nearly 15,000 heat-related deaths in France, mostly among the elderly, and caused the Serbian Danube to plummet so far that submerged World War II tanks and bombs were revealed. A further 10,000 died in Moscow in a heatwave in 2010. By 2030, we expect to see an additional 7,000 heat-related deaths here in the UK each year. Coming hand in hand with global heating is air pollution. Caused by the burning of fossil fuels, it is directly linked to 40,000 premature deaths annually in the UK, including 200 people in Newcastle alone. Impacts are more severe in heat waves, with both rural and urban populations also exposed to the smoke from forest and moorland fires. Finally, the resources that will be needed to treat these emerging health problems and to tackle the climate emergency itself are resources that cannot be spent in other areas of healthcare. So the indirect impacts of the climate crisis will reach into each and every area of current practice. As well as the direct health impacts of the climate emergency, healthcare also contributes to the problem through its own emissions. But how significant are these? Well, internationally, healthcare produces 4.4% of the global carbon footprint. More than 1 in 20 tonnes of CO2 equivalent produced by the UK comes from NHS activities. For further context, if healthcare were a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet. There are obvious sources of these greenhouse gas emissions, including the transport of patients and staff and the heating and lighting of our buildings. But by far the biggest culprit is procurement, or the way in which our drugs, devices, and other paraphernalia are manufactured, transported, and disposed of. The two biggest carbon hotspots, as shown here, are medical instruments and equipment in acute care and pharmaceuticals in primary care. So climate breakdown is indeed an emergency for both people and planet as a whole and for healthcare specifically, and which we all have a responsibility to tackle. It threatens us all, not just at some abstract time in the future, but now. But the changes that we need to make also represent the biggest opportunity for us. And it is this message of hope that we want to leave you with. Newcastle Hospitals Declaration of a Climate Emergency, the first healthcare organisation in the world to do so, has provided a benchmark for the rest of the health sector in the UK and further afield. A leap of faith, and with the hard work starting now. We, as employees of one of the largest and most complex hospital trusts in the country, could, however, have a greater impact on the climate emergency than we ever could as individuals working outside of it. We should also remember that our trust is an anchor institution for Newcastle, the wider region, and its NHS. We are here to stay, and the changes that we make within the organisation can have far-reaching consequences outside of it. Finally, we recognise that today that this talk is first being broadcast Friday the 20th of September represents an important day for the thousands of young people across the country who are taking action to secure their own futures in the face of environmental breakdown. Newcastle Hospitals is proud to stand together with our civic partners and people across the city in tackling the threat of the climate crisis.